must have gone off. So nice to be here. The last time I preached, we were still doing virtual service, and I was preaching to this TV screen full of faces, and that was surprisingly positive and affirming for me. And obviously, this is even better. And being a part of this community for the last 17 years has been one of the biggest blessings of my life. Thank you. But it's been a really tough month or so, hasn't it? For Beaverton, for Oregon, for our country, and for the world. I don't know, maybe somebody could do a statistical analysis and tell me that the last 30 days haven't been any worse than a lot of other 30-day periods in the news over the years, but the news has been really heavy for me lately. We've already talked about some of that today, haven't we? And I really hate to start this sermon out on such a downer, but I really feel the need just to rattle off some of the things that we've experienced over the last month. I promise I'm going to try my best to bring us to a better place before I sit down, but I just really feel the need to go through this. Just 4.5 weeks ago, April 27th, we learned about the tragic car crash at Murray and TV Highway, where a car full of Southridge High School students slammed into a sheriff's patrol car. 2 kids dead, 3 kids, and a police officer whose lives are forever changed. 5 days after that, on May the 2nd, a Supreme Court draft decision was leaked to the press that goes to extreme lengths to eviscerate Roe versus Wade. This church has always been proudly pro-choice, sometimes loudly pro-choice. But I know that in reality, this is not a binary issue the way it's sometimes portrayed. And I know that people here, just like people everywhere, are on a million points on a very wide spectrum on that issue. But I think it's fair to say that even a less belligerent overturning of Roe versus Wade is opposed by a solid majority of Americans, and that's been the case for decades. Pregnant people are already having to travel hundreds or thousands of miles to access health care, and that's going to get worse. And with legislation pending in some states, women who have an abortion out of state might be taking a legal risk by setting foot back in their home states afterwards. We may be in a position of having to set up a modern-day underground railroad to take care of people's needs. And the way the opinion is written, the next dominoes to fall might be contraception or marriage equality or even interracial marriage. A week after the draft opinion leaked on May the 9th, we learned about the death of 13-year-old Milana Lee, who was murdered in Beaverton's Murray Shoals neighborhood while she was out on a walk. And while not much is being said about the active investigation or the suspect who's been arrested, I get the impression that the fact that she's a recent immigrant to the United States was a factor. 5 days after that, on May the 14th, we had the mass shooting at the Tops supermarket in a tight-knit black neighborhood in Buffalo, New York. 10 people killed, 3 people injured. The perpetrator posted extensively on social media, and we quickly learned that he targeted Buffalo's east side because it had the largest concentration of black people within a few hours' drive of where he lived. And he chose a supermarket because he thought that would be the best location to instill terror in the black community and cause them to live in fear. The hatred is chilling. And the very next day, on May 15th, a gunman opened fire during a church potluck at the Taiwanese Presbyterian, the Irvine Taiwanese Presbyterian Church, which meets in the building of the Geneva Presbyterian Church of Laguna Woods, California, which is part of our PCUSA denomination. 1 person dead, 5 injured. It could have been much worse if it weren't for several courageous church members who subdued and hogtied the gunman before police could arrive. And although the perpetrator was Asian and spoke with church members in the Taiwanese Hokkien language, it seems that he acted out of hatred for Taiwan and the Taiwanese community. 2 days later, on May 17th, we had primary elections here in Oregon, and once again, Clackamas County is having problems. This is the county where an election worker was caught filling in Republican candidates on ballots where the voter had left a race blank. This time it seems like it might have just been incompetence, but the consequence is that Oregon, which has among the highest voter turnout and fewest election problems of any state, now has a public perception problem about the integrity of elections, and that's the last thing we need. 3 days after that, on May 20th, I saw a news article that deeply disturbed me. Xander Moritz, the first openly gay senior class president of Pineview School for the Gifted in Osprey, Florida, was preparing his commencement address for the graduation ceremony, but his principal warned him that his mic would be cut if he so much as mentioned his LGBTQ identity during the speech. Florida is the state where the governor recently signed the Don't Say Gay bill that puts LGBTQ teachers basically in permanent risk of legal liability, along with any teacher who mentions the existence of any kind of queer identity or relationship. And Xander said that experience made the last week of his senior year the worst week of his life. The bigotry has moved from whispers to out in the open in so many places. And then 4 days after that, this past Tuesday, May 24th, another mass shooting at Robb Elementary School in Uvalde, Texas. Uvalde is not on any of the well-beaten paths that I have in Texas, but I've driven through there several times over the years, and I have family in San Antonio and Austin, which are nearby. 19 fourth graders and 2 teachers dead, along with the shooter. 18 injured, including the shooter's grandmother. So devastating in every way. And such an obvious repudiation of the thesis that the only way to beat a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. Three days after that, this past Friday, I got an email that my kids are going to have a lockdown drill this week at school. It was pre-scheduled and didn't have anything to do with the Uvalde incident, and they've had several of those this year, but at this point I am just beyond words. And of course, all these events occurred against the backdrop of the war in Ukraine, started by a totally unjustified invasion by an authoritarian tyrant against a democratic nation that was just starting to find its way. And because of the surprising bravery and smart strategy and unity by the Ukrainians, the war is not over, and that's a good thing. Unfortunately, the war is settling into a slog that's probably not going to be over for a long, long time, and it's going to cost thousands of lives and billions of dollars of weapons and humanitarian assistance, and the loss of Ukrainian and Russian grain and other commodities in the world market is probably going to result in a pretty severe food shortage in a few months, especially in Africa and parts of Asia. I just pray that this doesn't result in mass starvation. I'm really sorry to spend so much time on such a depressing litany of current events, but that's where my heart has been as I've been preparing this sermon. Back a couple of months ago, when Scott first asked me to preach today, I looked at the lectionary text for this date, and I saw this fascinating tale from the book of Acts that we heard this morning. The tale about the earthquake that demonstrated that Paul had the power to escape his captors. And it's a typical story for the book of Acts, which is the epitome of accentuate the positive, eliminate the negative in the way the narrative is constructed. And it all starts when Paul and Silas are trying to help someone, right? Help someone who's been tormented for years and years and years. But sometimes you get in trouble for helping someone if doing so winds up bringing a little bit of an economic blip to somebody who already has a lot of money, right? So they drag Paul and Silas to the marketplace. That's the equivalent of taking them to court. But notice the gaslighting in what they say to the court. They don't say, oh, this property of ours, this person who we own, has lost economic value because of what this person has done. They didn't say the truth of what they were mad about, but what they said was, these Jews are advocating unlawful customs. These Jews are advocating unlawful customs. Yeah, that's what they were really concerned about, right? The purity of local customs. That was their motivation. And the mention of the fact that they were Jews was just coincidental, right? But Paul and Silas are thrown in jail because their accusers basically have the power to do it. And that night, the foundations were shaken. It's the creaking of the ark of the moral universe, right? You remember the quote from Dr. King, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. The book of Acts is full of miraculous stories like this. If you just read the book of Acts by itself and didn't have any other knowledge of the history of that period, you would get the impression that a significant percentage of the Roman world had accepted Christianity by the end of the story. In reality, the immediate impact was much smaller. And yet here we are today, 2,000 years later, sitting in a Christian church. There was an impact back then, even if it wouldn't have been super visible if we had taken like a journalistic newspaper reporter and plopped him down into the scene to report from the field. And I think if we look, we can see that foundations are shaking all around us. The arc of the moral universe is creaking all around us. Several days after the horrific event in Uvalde, the National Rifle Association had a convention in Houston, Texas, of all places. And the pictures I've seen from that event seem to indicate to me that there were more protesters outside than there were attendees inside. The foundations are shaking and the arc of the moral universe is quaking. And I think in the last month I have seen more testimonials on social media from just everyday women who tell the story of having had an abortion at some time in the past. In a lot of cases, they say, this is the first time I've told this story publicly. And that's so important because knowing somebody, 1 in 4 women in this country have had an abortion, but most people in this country don't know somebody that they know has had an abortion. And so it's important for us to get to know each other. That's the same thing that happened with marriage equality. Over a 20-year period, support in the public for marriage equality steadily went up 2% per year. That was almost exactly consistent from about the mid-90s to 2015. And Nate Silver did a lot of analysis of that, and he discovered that about 1% out of that 2%, about half of the growth every year in the support for marriage equality was because old people died off and young people came in, right? That's part of the factor there, but that only explained about half of the change. The other half of the change was the increase in the number of people who know somebody personally who's LGBTQ. And what that required was a lot of people coming out, right? And so I think as people who've had this experience come out and just get to know other people with that part of their identity public, I think that will help. The foundations are shaking, and I think it's happening all around us. You remember Xander Morix that I talked about a minute ago, who was giving the commencement speech? You know what he wound up doing? If you see a picture of this guy, he's got big curly hair. And so he used his curly hair as a metaphor for his identity. And he said, "I used to hate my curls. I spent mornings and nights embarrassed by them, trying to desperately straighten this part of who I am. But the daily damage of trying to fix myself became too much to endure. There are going to be so many kids with curly hair who need a community like Pineview, and they won't have one. Instead, they will try to fix themselves so they can exist in Florida's humid climate." He got the message across, and he got a standing ovation from his fellow students. Foundations are shaking all over the place. Despite that, I think things are going to get worse before they get better. And visible progress will be frustratingly slow. Some of those things we're hoping will happen, when the calendar turns to that that May of 2065. Hopefully we're not still working on it by then, but we may still be. We may have some setbacks. LGBTQ rights may have some setbacks in the relatively near future. And even if modest gun safety legislation can be passed at the federal level, the 300 million firearms currently out there in this country, and including 10 million assault rifles, probably have a pretty long, useful life before they're no longer a threat. Last fall, when the Texas abortion ban was passed and upheld by the Supreme Court, I heard a monologue by the podcaster Dan Savage. And he talked about an experience he had the night that ruling came out. Before he heard about the ruling, he walked over to a cannabis dispensary to get some edibles, and he had a conversation with the clerk, somebody he had never met before. And he talked about his relationship with his husband, and she talked about her relationship with her girlfriend. A perfectly natural conversation in a perfectly normal environment today. But as he noted, the conversation would not have happened a decade earlier. There were no recreational cannabis dispensaries a decade ago. Marriage equality didn't exist, so Dan Savage wasn't married. And as he noted, LGBTQ people were a lot more reticent about talking about their status just in casual conversations in public. And he went on to say the clerk can now earn close to a living wage by working in retail thanks to Seattle's $15 minimum wage and requirements for health care, which was not true a decade ago. And so that totally normal conversation in 2021 would not have happened in 2011. And he concluded by saying, I feel right now the way I felt in 2004 when anti-gay marriage initiatives passed in 11 states. I'm feeling despair. But we fought back and we won. And we can fight back and we can win. And we're going to have to fight back and we're going to have to win. And we will. And won't that be a moment? The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice, and the foundations are shaking. Amen.